The night her husband erased her from his life was the night Eleanor Whitmore finally became visible again. She did not know she was homeless until the motel clerk stopped looking her in the eye. He did not raise his voice. He did not explain much. He only pointed to the notice taped to her door, and his finger trembled slightly, the way people's hands do when they are delivering news they would rather not carry. Payment due by morning. 5 words, ordinary words, the kind printed on thousands of doors across the country every week. But for Eleanor, standing in the rain at 67 years old with 3 cardboard boxes stacked against the wall of room 14, those 5 words were the last ones her old life would ever speak to her. She had $26 in her purse, a wedding ring mark still pale on her finger, and somewhere across town in a house she had cleaned and paid for and filled with 42 years of family photographs, her ex-husband was sleeping beside a woman whose name Eleanor had learned only 3 months ago. The roof of that house did not leak. The porch light still worked. The kitchen window still faced east the way Eleanor had loved because morning light made coffee taste kinder. But none of that belonged to her anymore. Not the window, not the light, not even the memory of standing there with wet hands and a quiet heart watching the sun find its way across the counter. People in Ash Hollow would later say Eleanor disappeared. But that was not accurate. A woman cannot disappear when no one has been watching her clearly enough to notice the moment she leaves. And if you believe a 67-year-old woman rebuilding her life from a forgotten place deserves to be seen, take a moment and subscribe. Not because you were asked, but because every time we look away, someone like Eleanor fades a little more. The notice on the motel door was only the last thing Eleanor saw that night. The first betrayal had been signed months earlier, in handwriting she would have recognized anywhere but standing in the rain. With the paper grocery bag softening in her arms, she did not know that yet. She only knew the heater behind the curtain clicked, like it was struggling to stay alive, and the carpet smelled of damp shoes and old bleach. And the coat dripping from the back of the chair had left a dark circle on the floor that slowly widened the way silence does when no one is coming to break it. On the small table beside the bed sat the groceries she had chosen with careful hands that afternoon. A half loaf of bread, 1 can of chicken noodle soup, instant coffee, a carton of eggs with 1 corner crushed where the bag had pressed against the car door. She had counted every dollar before buying them. Not because Eleanor had forgotten how to manage money. She had managed money her entire marriage. She had stretched paychecks across months that did not want to cooperate. She had clipped coupons on Sunday mornings while Daniel read the real estate section. She had planned meals around what was marked down, made birthday cakes from scratch. Because bakery cakes were for people who could afford not to measure flour twice, and once hosted a dinner for 6 of Daniel's clients using a single chicken. 3 potatoes and the kind of smile that made everyone believe the evening had been effortless. But now the numbers did not stretch. They only warned her. Beside the bed were 3 cardboard boxes. That was what remained of the house where she had raised her son, hosted Christmas mornings, folded Daniel's shirts with the creases exactly where he liked them, and kept framed photographs dusted on the mantel even when no one visited for months. 1 box held divorce papers. 1 held family pictures wrapped in newspaper so the glass would not crack. The last held small things no one else would have thought to save. Her mother's recipe cards, written in a cursive that leaned slightly left the way her mother's posture had in her later years. A sewing tin with a faded picture of butter cookies on the lid. A pair of reading glasses. And an old wooden-handled brush she had once used to clean dust from carved furniture, back when her hands still remembered what they were made for. Eleanor picked up the brush. For a moment, her fingers wrapped around the handle the way they had 30 years ago, and something shifted inside her chest. Not hope. Hope was too large a word for a motel room with a payment notice on the door. Something smaller. A muscle memory that had outlasted everything else. Before Daniel's career, before the dinner parties, before she became the woman who remembered everyone else's needs and never once asked the room to remember hers. There had been a shop, A small furniture repair shop near Lexington, where a younger Eleanor had worked with varnish under her nails and sawdust on her sleeves, and a notebook full of sketches she believed would one day become real. Rocking chairs with curved arms that fit the human palm, side tables with hand-cut joinery, a cabinet with glass doors she designed during her lunch break. And on the first page written in pencil, she never erased a name for the business she planned to build, Whitmore Restorations. It was not a fantasy. It was a plan, the kind young women make before the world teaches them that plans belong to other people. Then Daniel's real estate career moved faster than either of them expected. And the shape of Eleanor's days changed the way water changes when someone drops a stone into it. First came evening phone calls she learned not to interrupt. Then weekend open houses she learned to attend in pressed dresses with a smile that said, "This man is trustworthy. Look how well his wife holds a glass of wine." Then client dinners in their own dining room, where Eleanor remembered the names Daniel forgot, set flowers on the table when the budget said no, and cooked for men who praised the warmth of the home without once asking who created it. She told herself it was partnership. Daniel was building something. She was helping him build it. The shop could wait. Then Aaron was born and the word wait grew roots. Bottles at midnight. School forms signed at the kitchen counter. Doctor visits where she sat alone because Daniel was showing a property. Birthday cakes with crooked frosting and candles that never matched. Lost shoes found behind the dryer. Laundry folded after everyone else was asleep because the sound of the machine bothered Daniel when he was reviewing contracts. The repair shop became weekend work, then occasional work, then something she would get back to later. Later became the most dangerous word in Eleanor's vocabulary. Later when Daniel's career settled. Later when Aaron started school. Later when the mortgage felt lighter. Later when everyone needed less from her. But everyone never needed less. They only became accustomed to her giving more. Her tools migrated from the kitchen table to the laundry room shelf, from the shelf to a box in the garage, from the garage to a space behind Christmas decorations and old paint cans, where no one looked unless they needed a Phillips head screwdriver. No one told her to stop. That would have been something she could fight. Instead, life simply kept needing dinner, clean towels, a calm voice at midnight when Aaron had a fever, a birthday remembered for a neighbor, a problem solved quietly before anyone else noticed it existed. And Eleanor became so good at holding everything together that people stopped seeing the hands doing the holding. Her phone lay face down on the motel bed. Aaron had called that afternoon from Oregon, and Eleanor had let it ring. His voice always carried the sound of his life happening around him. A cabinet closing, his wife asking someone about homework, a child laughing at something Eleanor could not see. He would ask if she was okay. He always asked. And Eleanor would say what she always said. "I'm doing all right, sweetheart." She said it like a mother protecting her son from weather he could not control, not like a woman who might not have a room tomorrow. Because if she told Aaron the truth, he would come. And if he came, his wife would rearrange the guest room with that particular kind of hospitality that is generous and cautious at the same time. His children would grow quiet around her. Dinner would feel careful. And Eleanor would become the thing she feared most. An emergency someone else had to manage. Or maybe, if she was being honest in the way only a dark motel room at midnight allows, she needed one person left on earth who still believed she was not falling apart. Eleanor opened the manila folder on the bed. The property settlement sat on top its pages slightly curled from being read and reread in different rooms over different weeks. She had looked at these documents before. But fear has a way of blurring the details until the mind is ready to absorb what the heart already suspects. This time, one line stopped her. A date. Not from the week Daniel said he was leaving. Not from the month he first mentioned wanting something different. The date was from spring, late April, back when Eleanor was still kneeling in the garden bed behind the kitchen window, pressing tomato seedlings into soil she had turned by hand, back when she was still washing his coffee cup each morning and placing it on the second shelf because that was where Daniel reached first. Back when she still believed they were growing old in the same house on the same porch, watching the same maple tree turn amber every October the way it had for 42 years. But on that April date, Daniel had already contacted a property appraiser. He had already requested a market valuation. He had already begun the arithmetic of dividing a life he had not yet told Eleanor he intended to leave. Her hand tightened on the page. The paper bent slightly beneath her thumb, and she noticed absurdly that her nail was still clean, as if the body could maintain small dignities while the mind absorbed a wound this size. Daniel had not made a sudden mistake. He had not fallen into confusion or been swept away by some midlife recklessness he would later regret in the way country songs promise men do. He had made arrangements, quiet ones, legal ones, the kind that require signatures and dates, and the particular calm of a man who has already decided to leave but wants the math to work out before the conversation begins. And Eleanor, the woman who had kept that house alive for 4 decades, had been the last person invited into the truth of its ending. Outside, rain tapped against the motel window in a rhythm that almost sounded patient. The notice waited in her purse. By morning, she would have to leave this room too. But before she could figure out where she was going, she needed to sit with what she now understood, that the life she had built with both hands had been taken apart one quiet signature at a time by the man who had promised in a church in Lexington, in front of people who brought casserole dishes as wedding gifts, to build it with her. Eleanor placed the key to their old house on the motel nightstand. She had carried it for weeks. It was useless now. The locks had been changed. The rooms had been emptied by a moving company Daniel hired while she was at a doctor's appointment. But she could not throw the key away, not because she believed it would ever open that door again, because letting go of it felt like admitting that 42 years could fit inside something small enough to disappear between coins and receipts at the bottom of a handbag. The key sat on the nightstand beneath the lamp, and it did not shine. It just waited there the way Eleanor waited, for what neither of them knew yet. By the 3rd month, Eleanor's savings had thinned to a number she checked every morning and regretted every night. She learned which grocery stores marked down bread near closing, which motel lobbies kept coffee out past breakfast, which library branches stayed open latest and had the softest chairs near the heat vents. She washed clothes in motel sinks and dried them on the shower rod and packed them back into the same box each time she moved, because unpacking would mean she had stopped moving, and stopping meant admitting she had nowhere left to go. One afternoon, rain began while she was inside the county library near Ash Hollow. Eleanor sat near the back with a gardening book open on her lap, though she had not turned the page in 20 minutes. The words blurred and reassembled and blurred again, not because her eyes were weak, but because her mind was somewhere else entirely. Across the room, a grandfather sat with his granddaughter on his knee, helping her sound out a word she could not quite reach. The girl pointed at the page. The old man leaned close. He did not correct her. He waited. And when she found the word herself, his hand rested briefly on her hair, the way hands do when love does not need to explain itself. Eleanor looked down before anyone could see her face change. She did not miss Daniel. That part had begun to loosen the way a bandage loosens when the wound beneath it has finally dried. But she missed belonging somewhere without having to explain why she was there. She missed being a person in a room who did not need a reason to sit down. When the library closed, she walked to her old Buick in the parking lot. The back seat held her boxes beneath a blanket. The gas needle hovered near the orange. On the passenger seat was a county map she had taken from a rack near the front desk, the kind printed on thin paper, with fold lines already softening from use. She meant to drive back toward the cheapest motel. She had been calculating the route all afternoon, measuring distances against the money in her wallet, the way a sailor measures wind against the weight of the boat. But her eyes caught a line on the map she had not noticed before. A thin gray road east of Ash Hollow. No town name beside it. No church. No gas station. Just a service road curving into the hills and stopping at a small rectangle marked with 2 words, Quarry closed. Eleanor stared at the map for a long time. Rain ran down the windshield in lines that bent and merged and disappeared. Then she started the engine and turned east. The pavement narrowed within minutes. Trees leaned close enough to brush the mirrors, and the headlights caught only wet bark and dark leaves, and the faint reflection of animal eyes that vanished before Eleanor could name what they belonged to. Then through the brush, she saw a rusted gate hanging crooked from one hinge. Beside it, an old sign had faded almost to white. She stopped the car and let the engine idle while she read the words that were left. Quarry site closed. Every door for 3 months had told Eleanor the same thing. You cannot stay. But this one, this forgotten one, hung open. She pulled forward slowly, and the gate did not resist. That was the first thing that unsettled her. Something that old and rusted should have protested, should have scraped against the gravel or groaned on its hinge the way things do when they have been left alone too long and forgotten how to welcome anyone. But the gate only moved under the weight of her hand, as if it had been waiting for someone who would not demand it to look presentable first. The quarry appeared all at once, not gradually the way towns reveal themselves. All at once the way wounds do. Tall limestone walls rose on 3 sides pale and streaked with dark rainwater. At the bottom, shallow pools reflected a sky the color of old silver. Rusted equipment foundations sat beneath vines. Young trees had grown through cracks where trucks must have passed daily 30 years ago. The silence was enormous. No highway noise, no motel television bleeding through thin walls. Only rain falling into stone and the engine of Eleanor's Buick ticking as it cooled. Near the back wall, partly hidden behind sycamore trees, whose bark peeled in long pale strips, she saw the cabin. It was smaller than anything she had imagined calling shelter. A narrow wooden structure with a sagging porch, a rusted metal roof. 2 front windows clouded with grime, thick enough to erase whatever was behind them. One shutter hung loose. Moss darkened the steps. A stovepipe leaned from one side at an angle that suggested it had survived years of wind by stubbornness rather than engineering. Eleanor parked several yards away and sat with both hands on the steering wheel. The cabin did not look welcoming. It did not look safe. It looked the way she felt. Tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with being expected to hold a shape that no longer fit. She stepped out into the rain. The porch board dipped under her left foot. She froze, listened. Nothing moved inside. The front door had swollen from weather and age, and Eleanor had to press her shoulder against it twice before it gave way with a soft crack like old wood finally releasing a breath it had held too long. The smell met her first. Dust, mildew, cold ashes, and beneath all of it something dry and patient like timber that had been waiting years for warmth. The main room was nearly bare. A cast-iron stove sat against the far wall, its door slightly ajar. A cracked chair lay on its side in the corner. There was a kitchen area with stained cabinets and a sink that coughed out nothing when she turned the handle. In the next room, a narrow bed frame without a mattress, a bathroom with a rusted faucet, a cracked mirror, and a floor that sagged near the tub. Above her, water dripped into a tin pot someone had placed beneath the leak long ago. The drip was steady, unhurried, almost musical if Eleanor held still long enough to let her breathing match it. She walked back into the main room and stopped. Against the far wall, pushed into shadow, was a table, heavy, dark, warped along one edge with deep scars across its surface. Burned rings from old cups, knife marks, scratches that told of decades of use by hands that had not been gentle. Most people would have seen junk. Eleanor saw walnut. She crossed the room before her mind gave permission. Her palm found the surface. She brushed dust away with the heel of her hand slowly the way she had once cleaned furniture in the shop in Lexington, when she was 23 and believed that damaged things were only waiting for someone patient enough to ask them what they still had left. Under the grime, the grain was still there, faint, buried, running in long dark lines beneath the filth the way rivers run beneath ice in winter. Not gone, not ruined, just unseen, the way Eleanor had been unseen, the way the cabin itself had been unseen. the way certain lives go unnoticed until someone arrives who knows how to look without flinching at what time has done. Her fingers traced a deep gouge near the table's edge. She did not know who had made it. She did not know whose coffee had left the dark ring beside her thumb. She did not know whose weight had worn the surface smooth in one spot and rough in another. But she recognized the table the way one wounded thing recognizes another. Not with pity, but with the quiet understanding that survival is its own kind of beauty. She whispered without meaning to, "You and me both." The rain picked up outside. Water tapped through the roof into the tin pot, and the sound filled the cabin with a rhythm that was not comfort exactly, but was close enough to keep. Eleanor stood alone in that broken room, with her hand on a table no one had cared about in years. And for the first time since the motel, since the papers, since the April date that proved her life had been sold before she was told it was for sale, the silence around her did not feel like rejection. It felt like room. She only meant to stay until the rain stopped. That was the sensible plan, and Eleanor was above all else a sensible woman. Sensible women did not sleep in quarries. Sensible women called their sons. Sensible women found shelters with proper doors and people who asked your name and wrote it on a clipboard. But Sensible had kept Eleanor invisible for 42 years. Sensible had folded Daniel's shirts. Sensible had smiled at dinner guests. Sensible had put her own notebook in a box behind Christmas decorations and never once shouted that the box was getting heavier. Evening filled the quarry early. The limestone walls swallowed the light, the way deep water swallows sound. And by the time Eleanor returned to the porch, the road behind her had disappeared into the trees. She went back to the Buick, pulled the blanket from the back seat, and sat in the driver's seat with the door cracked open, listening to rain fall around the cabin. She had no right to and no reason to leave. Before sleeping, she reached into her purse and took out the old house key. She held it in her palm for a long moment. Then she walked through the rain to the cabin door and set the key on the walnut table beside the burn rings and the knife marks and the decades of use that no one had bothered to honor. A useless key on a forgotten table. Two things the world had discarded sitting together in the dark, waiting to find out if they still mattered. And somewhere outside the quarry, past the rusted gate and the dark trees and the thin gray road that led back to Ash Hollow, a man named Daniel Whitmore was sleeping in a house that remembered nothing about him. But that part of the story had not arrived yet. For now, there was only Eleanor, the rain, the table, and the sound of water falling into a tin pot, keeping time for a woman who had finally stopped counting what she had lost and started listening for what was left. By morning, Eleanor understood the cabin was not quiet in daylight. It creaked, it settled, it clicked when wind moved through the broken window frame the way an old dog shifts in sleep. Not alarmed, just reminding the room it was still breathing. She woke in the Buick with a stiff neck and cold fingers, and the particular confusion of a woman who opens her eyes expecting a ceiling and finds a windshield instead. The quarry looked different under pale light. The limestone walls had lost their menace and turned the color of old bone. Shallow pools at the base caught the sky and held it still. For a moment, the whole place looked like something that had once been important and was now resting between uses. And Eleanor thought that was a generous way to describe abandonment until she realized she was also describing herself. She stepped out of the car. The cabin waited across the wet ground with its sagging porch and rusted roof, and the patience of something that had stopped expecting visitors years ago but had not yet given up on the idea entirely. Inside, the dark stain on the ceiling near the stove had spread overnight. One corner of the front step had softened enough that her heel nearly went through it. The tin pot beneath the leak was full. Eleanor emptied it and set it back. Then she made a decision that sounded small enough to be harmless. She would not call this home. She would only make it safe enough for one more night. She drove into Ash Hollow on fumes and spent $23 at a hardware store with wooden floors and a bell above the door that rang with the tired cheerfulness of something that had been announcing arrivals for decades. She bought duct tape, a blue tarp matches a cheap broom, 2 cans of soup, and a packet of nails she studied for a long time before choosing. Because choosing wrong when you have $11 left is not a mistake you recover from quickly. The clerk looked at her muddy shoes and then at the tarp. His eyes moved the way small-town eyes do when they are calculating how much to ask. Storm damage. Eleanor nodded. It was not exactly a lie. Every kind of storm leaves damage. Some just take longer to notice. Back at the quarry, she swept the main room until dust rose in gray clouds that turned the light inside the cabin the color of old photographs. She taped plastic over the cracked window. She dragged rotten cardboard and broken boards outside and stacked them near the tree line because even a place this neglected deserved the dignity of order. By late afternoon, her shoulders burned, and her lower back had begun the low protest it had started making sometime after 60. And Eleanor realized she had not eaten since the night before. She opened a can of chicken noodle soup and tried the wood stove. The first smoke came back into the room so fast it felt personal. Eleanor stumbled outside, coughing, one hand pressed against her chest, the other still holding the bent lid of the soup can, because her mind had not yet caught up with her lungs. She stood on the porch with tears streaming from the smoke and watched gray clouds pour through the cabin doorway, like the stove had been holding its breath for years and had finally decided to exhale everything at once. That was when she heard the truck. Not close at first. A low grind of engine somewhere beyond the trees, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew every washed-out turn and did not need pavement to feel certain. The sound grew until a faded blue pickup appeared on the quarry road, its bed loaded with scrap lumber, its windshield cracked along the passenger side in a line so old it had turned white. The truck stopped several yards from the cabin. An old man stepped out. He wore a canvas jacket the color of creek mud work boots, with laces that did not match, and a cap darkened by so many seasons of weather, it no longer had an original color. His beard was white along the jaw and trimmed short the way men trim beards when they have no one to impress but still believe in keeping things even. In one hand he carried a metal toolbox that swung with the weight of objects that had spent decades being useful. He looked at the smoking doorway, then at Eleanor, then at the tarp folded near the steps. His voice came dry and level the way a fence post would sound if fence posts could talk. You trying to heat that cabin or smoke yourself like a Virginia ham? Eleanor should have been embarrassed. The smoke was still drifting from the door. Her eyes were red. Her coat was dusted with ash. But she was too tired to perform the kind of polished composure she had practiced for 42 years of dinner parties. And something about the old man's voice made pretending feel unnecessary. I thought the stove would work. It might, if the pipe ain't packed full of bird nests and 20 years of regret. He looked up at the leaning stovepipe and squinted as if the diagnosis was visible from the ground. Name's Walter Briggs, worked this quarry 30 years before they shut it down and pretended the stone ran out. It didn't run out. The money did. Stone's still here. Stone's always here. Eleanor tightened her grip on the porch rail. I'm not trying to cause trouble. Walter studied her face for a moment. Not the way people stare when they want gossip, or when they are assembling a story to tell later at a counter somewhere. More like he was measuring how much weight a person was carrying before deciding whether to offer a hand or a chair. His words came after a pause that felt deliberate. Trouble usually gets here before folks do. Then he opened the toolbox. He did not ask why she was there. He did not ask how long she planned to stay. He did not ask about the Buick with the boxes in the back seat, or the tarp she had bought with money she probably could not spare. That silence was the first kindness, and Eleanor received it the way parched ground receives rain, without comment but completely. Walter cleared the stovepipe in 12 minutes. He pulled out a nest packed with twigs, feathers, dry leaves, and a layer of soot so dense it crumbled in his hands like dark chalk. He showed Eleanor the nest before tossing it into the weeds, and his voice carried the patience of a man who had long ago decided that showing was more useful than telling. Fire don't forgive guessing. You learn that fast out here, or you learn it the hard way, which is the same thing, but with less eyebrows. He made her watch as he checked the draft, adjusted the stove door, and fed the first small fire with kindling. He split from a scrap board using the back of a hatchet. He pulled from the toolbox as casually as another man might pull out a pen. The fire caught. Smoke rose through the pipe and out into the quarry air in a thin gray line, and for the first time the cabin smelled like warmth rather than memory. Then Walter handed Eleanor the brush from the stovepipe kit. "Your turn." She stared at it. "My turn. If you're staying even one more night, your hands need to know what keeps you alive." That sentence did not comfort her. It settled into her the way a nail settles into wood, with resistance first, and then a hold that would not let go. For the next hour, Walter showed her which porch boards could not be trusted, how to brace the broken step using a piece of oak from his truck bed, and where rain was entering beneath the roof metal along the eastern seam. He demonstrated each repair once. Then he waited while Eleanor tried. Her first nail bent sideways. She looked at Walter. He said nothing. Her second went in crooked, and the board shifted. He still said nothing. He simply watched the way an old dog watches a puppy try to carry a stick that is twice its length. Not judging, just present. By the fifth nail the board held. It was not beautiful. The nail head sat slightly raised, and the board was a quarter-inch off true. But it held. Eleanor looked at it longer than the repair deserved. It was only one board, but it was the first thing she had fixed for herself in longer than she could remember, and the feeling that passed through her was not pride exactly. It was closer to the feeling of hearing your own name spoken aloud after a long time in a place where no one knows it. Before leaving, Walter stood beside his truck and looked back at the cabin, the way a man looks at a photograph of a place he once knew. His voice dropped half a register. "Folks in town think this place belongs to nobody. That ain't exactly true." Eleanor's stomach tightened. Who owns it? Walter's eyes moved toward the far quarry wall, where vines covered a concrete foundation, so completely it looked like the earth was trying to swallow something it did not want to remember. That's the question. Been the question for a long time. He reached into his coat pocket and handed her a small folded paper with a phone number written in pencil that had been sharpened with a knife. "If that stove acts up again, call before you do something heroic." He climbed into the truck, and the engine turned over with the sound of metal that had been starting and stopping for 30 years, and saw no reason to change the arrangement. Eleanor stood in the fading light with the paper in one hand and the hammer in the other, and the cabin behind her felt different now. Not safe, not hers, but no longer just a place where she was hiding. More like a place that had its own questions and had been waiting for someone willing to ask them. She began with the table. For 3 days after Walter left, Eleanor told herself there were more important repairs: the roof seam, the second window, the porch rail that wobbled when she leaned against it. But each time she crossed the main room, her eyes returned to the walnut table against the wall, its broken leg, its blackened surface, the deep scars that made it look like something the quarry had chewed up and spit out. She pulled it towards the window on the fourth morning, where the light was strong enough to show her what needed fixing first. The broken leg joint, the warped edge along the back, the split near the center that had widened over years of damp and neglect. She had already cleaned the surface during her first nights in the cabin. Now came the harder work. The work that required measuring and cutting, and the particular courage of a woman who had not held a saw in 30 years, and was no longer certain her hands remembered the conversation between blade and wood. Her first serious mistake arrived quickly. She cut the replacement brace too short. The second piece split when she drove the nail too hard, and the sound of the wood cracking open made her flinch the way she used to flinch when Daniel's voice rose during an argument, not at the volume, but at the reminder that something she was trying to hold together had just come apart. The third piece fit badly. The table rocked worse than before. Eleanor sat back on her heels and stared at it. Shame arrived fast the way it always did. The voice she had carried for decades, the one that sounded like practicality, but was actually fear, whispered the things it always whispered. That she had waited too long. That whatever skill she once had was gone. That a woman who could not keep her marriage or her house or even a motel room had no business pretending she could restore anything at all. Then a drop of water landed in the tin pot near the stove. The sound pulled her back. One drop, then another, small, steady, ordinary. The pot did not care whether Eleanor believed in herself. The leak did not stop because she was discouraged. The cabin simply went on being broken in its patient way, and somewhere inside that patience, Eleanor found enough room to pick up the brace again. She measured twice, cut once, waited 3 full breaths before hammering. The joint held, not perfectly, but the table stood, and when she pressed her palm against the surface, nothing moved. Over the next week, she sanded, carefully stopping before the scars disappeared, because the scars were not damage. They were evidence. She filled the deepest split with wood filler and smoothed it flush. She cleaned the joints. She rubbed oil into the surface until the walnut warmed beneath her hand, the way skin warms when someone finally touches it after a long time alone. She did not make the table look new. New would have been a lie. She made it honest. When Walter returned 3 days later, with a bag of roofing nails and a look on his face that suggested checking on Eleanor was becoming a habit he had not planned on, he stepped inside the cabin and stopped. He removed his cap. He ran one rough hand across the table's surface, the way a man touches something he is not sure he has the right to touch. Eleanor waited. She had not realized how badly she wanted him to speak, until the silence stretched long enough to frighten her. Walter nodded slowly. Quarrymen ate lunch on this table for years. Coffee, cards, pay envelopes. Bad news, good news, all of it. He looked at her. You left the marks. I thought they belonged there. They do. 2 words. Eleanor carried them for days the way she had once carried the house key, except these were not useless. These opened something. A week later, she drove into Ash Hollow for supplies and stopped at Mabel's kitchen because the rain had returned and the diner was warm, and she had learned that warmth was worth more than pride when your bones ached and your hands smelled of linseed oil. The place was small, red vinyl booths, fogged windows. The smell of bacon grease so deep in the walls it had probably become structural. The waitress, Ruth Ann, had a face built for efficiency and a voice that managed to be kind without being soft. She had seen Eleanor before buying sandpaper at the hardware store, filling a water jug at the gas station existing in Ash Hollow, the way certain people exist in small towns, present but unexplained. This time, Ruth Ann's eyes moved to Eleanor's hands. Sawdust sat in the creases of her knuckles. A thin line of oil darkened the edge of one nail. Ruth Ann's voice was casual, but her eyes were not. You work with wood. Eleanor looked down at her hands as if they belonged to someone she was only beginning to recognize. A little. Ruth Ann tilted her head toward a small table near the front window. One leg had been wrapped in silver duct tape. A stack of menus leaned against it to keep it steady, and the whole arrangement had the resigned look of something that had been waiting for real help while making do with whatever was available. My brother keeps saying he'll fix that. He's been saying it since Easter. Easter was 7 months ago. The word no reached Eleanor's tongue out of habit. She had spent decades deflecting her own abilities the way modest women do not, because they lack a confidence, but because they have been trained to believe that offering too much makes them inconvenient. But the table by the window looked the way the walnut table had looked before Eleanor's hands found it, tired, overlooked, waiting. I could look at it, she said. Not a promise, not confidence, just a door cracked open wide enough for air to pass through. 2 days later, Ruth Ann let her take the table. Eleanor repaired it in the cabin, working slowly, sanding away the sticky film of years, tightening the weak leg, polishing the top, until the wood stopped looking embarrassed under the light. When she returned, Ruth Ann set it near the window and taped a small handwritten card to the edge, restored by E. Whitmore. Eleanor stared at the card. Her name looked strange out in the open. For a year it had existed only on legal documents and motel registers, places where names are recorded but not remembered. Now it sat on a table in a window where people passing on the sidewalk could read it without knowing anything about the woman it belonged to, except that she had made something broken whole weight again. The next morning, Ruth Ann called Walter's number because Eleanor had no steady phone signal at the quarry. A customer wanted to buy the table. Eleanor drove to town telling herself not to expect much, because expecting much was how a person got flattened, and she had been flattened enough for several lifetimes. Ruth Ann handed her $80 in folded bills. Eleanor held the money in both hands. It was not enough to change her life. It would not pay a month's rent anywhere. It would not bring back the house or undo the signatures or make Daniel feel what he should have felt before he called Marissa by her first name. But it was the first money Eleanor had earned with her own hands in longer than she could remember. Not alimony, not settlement, not survival arithmetic. This had come from skill she thought she had lost, applied to wood she thought was finished in a place everyone else had forgotten. Ruth Ann watched her from behind the counter. People asked who made it. I told them E. Whitmore. Eleanor looked at the empty spot by the window where the table had stood. For months she had been trying to remain invisible. Now her name sat in a diner window in a town she had not chosen, and strangers were speaking it to each other over coffee. Names have a way of traveling in small towns carried by the same currents that carry weather and gossip, and the slow, reliable movement of people who drive the same roads every day. Within 2 weeks, a woman brought Eleanor a rocking chair with a cracked spindle. Then a man appeared at Mabel's kitchen asking if E. Whitmore could look at a bookcase his wife refused to throw away. Then a church deacon left a note with Ruth Ann about a set of pew ends that had been removed during renovation and was sitting in a shed behind the fellowship hall, waiting for someone who understood that old wood does not stop being sacred just because the building changes shape. Eleanor said yes to each one. Not eagerly, carefully, the way a person steps onto ice testing the surface before committing weight. She worked in the cabin with the door open when the weather allowed, and the quarry filled with sounds it had not heard in years. The rasp of sandpaper, the tap of a mallet, the particular silence that happens when a woman holds a piece of wood up to the light and turns it slowly, reading the grain the way another person might read a letter from someone they loved. She did not erase the scars. She never erased the scars. She only made the wood strong enough to carry them honestly. On a cold Tuesday in late autumn, while pulling loose boards from beneath the kitchen cabinet to check for rot, Eleanor felt one floorboard lift differently from the others. It rose too easily at one end, as if someone had pried it up before and set it back in a hurry. The way people handle things they want to hide, but also want to find again someday. She set down the pry bar. The cabin was quiet. Outside, dry leaves scraped across the porch in the wind, and the sound was so much like whispered conversation that Eleanor almost looked toward the door. Under the board was a narrow space packed with dust and mouse droppings, and something wrapped in oilcloth so old it cracked when she touched it. She reached in carefully. The bundle came loose with a soft tear. Inside were folded papers, a stained map of the quarry property, and a rusted key. Eleanor held the key in her palm. It was heavier than the house key she had carried for months, darker, older. The kind of key that belonged to a lock built in a time when locks were made to last longer than the people who used them. She set it on the walnut table beside the house key, and the two sat together like sentences from different chapters of the same story. The map was hand-drawn, its edges brown with age. Most of the writing had faded beyond reading, but one section remained clear. A line had been drawn around the cabin, the spring path behind it, and a narrow strip leading toward the old service road. Not the whole quarry, just this piece. And beside the outline, written in black pencil by a hand that pressed hard enough to leave grooves in the paper, were two words: caretaker parcel. Eleanor read them twice. She did not understand their legal weight, but her body understood something her mind had not yet assembled, because her hands had gone completely still, and Eleanor's hands only went still when they recognized that what they were holding mattered more than what they were feeling. That evening, Walter came by with a sack of potatoes and the unhurried air of a man who had decided that looking after someone was simply part of his week now. Eleanor waited until he had set the potatoes on the counter before placing the map on the walnut table between them. Walter did not reach for it. He looked at the map the way a man looks at a grave he has not visited in a long time. Then he looked at the cabin walls, then back at the map. "You've seen this before," Eleanor said. Walter rubbed one thumb across the edge of the paper. "Not this exact one, but something like it." He was quiet long enough for the fire in the stove to pop twice. There were stories, back when the quarry was closing. Folks said the cabin wasn't listed with the main quarry land. Said it had been separated years earlier, deeded to whoever kept watch out here. Who kept watch? Walter's voice dropped the way voices do when they are carrying something that has waited a long time to be said. Woman named Hattie Groves lived here through the 40s when the men went to war, and somebody still had to mind the equipment check, the water levels, keep the roads passable. She was a widow, kept to herself, fix things. He paused. Sound familiar? Eleanor said nothing, but her eyes moved to the rusted key on the table, and she wondered whose hand had held it last, and whether that hand had been as tired as hers, and whether Hattie Groves had also whispered to the walnut table in the dark when there was no one else to hear. What happened to her? Same thing that happens to most people who keep places alive without being asked. Folks forgot she was here. Company changed hands. Records got muddy. Taxes got paid by someone, then by nobody. After a while, the cabin just sat, and Hattie's name disappeared the way names do when no one writes them down in a place that matters. Eleanor looked at the two keys on the table, one from a home that had been taken, one from a woman who had been forgotten, both waiting on a surface Eleanor had brought back to life with her own hands. What does this mean for me? Walter did not answer quickly, and Eleanor had learned by now that his silences were not empty. They were the space where he kept the truths that needed careful handling. It means you need to find out before somebody else does. The next morning, Eleanor drove to the county records office wearing her best sweater and carrying the papers in a folder tied with kitchen string. The woman behind the counter had the polite, measured smile people use when they believe an older person has wandered into the wrong office with the wrong question. Eleanor explained the quarry, the cabin, the map, the phrase caretaker parcel. The woman typed, frowned, disappeared into a back room. When she returned, the smile was gone. There was a request made on this property 2 weeks ago. Eleanor felt her fingers tighten around the folder until the kitchen string pressed a line into her palm. By who? I can't give you that information. Eleanor sat in the Buick in the parking lot with the map on her lap and the engine off. 2 weeks ago, she had barely begun fixing the porch. She had not yet repaired the table. She had not yet heard her name spoken aloud in Mabel's kitchen by a woman she barely knew. 2 weeks ago, Eleanor was invisible, but someone had already been looking at the ground beneath her feet. She started the engine and was about to pull out when she saw it. A folded paper tucked beneath the windshield wiper. She reached out and unfolded it with fingers that were steadier than they should have been, because Eleanor had spent a lifetime receiving bad news with steady hands, while everything inside her shook. One typed line. No signature. No date. The quarry is private property. Stay away. Eleanor read it twice. Then she folded it carefully, placed it inside the folder with the old map, and drove back toward the quarry. She did not speed. She did not cry. She had spent 42 years watching a man dismantle her life with documents, and she had promised herself in that motel room that no piece of paper would ever again make her disappear without a fight. But that night, after showing the note to Walter, after watching his face tighten, the way wood tightens before it cracks. After hearing his voice drop to a register she had not heard before, Eleanor lay in the cabin in the dark and listened to the quarry breathe around her. 3 keys sat on the walnut table now. The old house key, the rusted key from beneath the floorboard, and somewhere out there in the hands of someone she could not yet name a third key, was turning trying to unlock the only door Eleanor had left. Eleanor did not sleep that night. She lay in the narrow bed she had assembled from the old frame and a second-hand mattress Walter had hauled in the back of his truck 2 weeks earlier. And she listened to the quarry the way a woman listens to a house she is not sure will be hers by morning. Every sound carried weight, the stove ticking as it cooled, wind pressing against the tarp she had nailed over the eastern seam, the tin pot catching its steady drip beneath the last leak she had not yet reached. The note sat on the walnut table beside the 2 keys. One typed line. No name, no return. Just a sentence designed to make a woman feel like a trespasser in the only place that had not asked her to leave. But Eleanor had been made to feel like a trespasser before. In her own kitchen, when Daniel's calls grew quiet and his office door stayed closed. In her own home, when the property appraiser walked the rooms she had painted and measured the floors she had kept clean and never once asked who lived there. In every motel lobby where she stood too long calculating whether she could afford another night, or whether the math had finally run out of patience with her. She had survived all of that by being careful, by being quiet, by folding herself into smaller and smaller shapes until she fit inside whatever space was offered. But this time, Eleanor did not fold. She rose before dawn. She lit the stove with the steady hands Walter had taught her to trust. She boiled water and made coffee in the dented pot she had found in the cabinet and scrubbed clean during her first week. And she sat at the walnut table with her notebook open and a pencil in her hand and began writing down everything she could prove. The dates she had arrived, the repairs she had made listed by week with the receipts she had saved in a manila envelope behind the stove. The names of people in Ash Hollow who had brought her furniture to restore. The measurements of the boards she had replaced on the porch. The hours she had spent clearing the quarry road of fallen branches after the October storm so that Walter's truck could pass. The morning she had found the spring path behind the cabin and cleared it of deadfall until clean water ran again for the first time in years. She wrote it all down. Not because she understood property law, not because she believed a notebook full of pencil marks could stand against whoever had typed that note, but because Eleanor had learned something in this cabin that Daniel had spent 42 years making sure she forgot. That a woman who keeps records of her own work is a woman who cannot be quietly erased. By the time the sun reached the quarry floor, she had filled 4 pages. Walter arrived at 9 with a look on his face that told Eleanor he had not slept well either. He brought a thermos of coffee and a folded piece of paper from his own records. A letter from the quarry company dated 19 years earlier, acknowledging that the cabin parcel had been excluded from the main property transfer when the quarry changed hands. The letter did not prove ownership, but it proved separation. And separation meant the cabin was not simply part of the quarry that someone could claim whole. Eleanor read the letter twice. Then she placed it inside her folder beside the old map and the typed threat and her 4 pages of notes. And she tied the folder shut with the same kitchen string she had used the first time she carried it into the records office. Ruth Ann called Walter's phone that afternoon. A man had come into Mabel's kitchen asking about the woman who restored furniture. Not the furniture itself, the woman. He had left a business card on the counter beside his coffee cup, and Ruth Ann had picked it up after he left and read the name printed on it in small, careful letters. Daniel Whitmore, Real Estate Consultation. Eleanor heard the name through Walter's phone and felt it land inside her chest, the way a stone lands in still water. Not with violence, with the slow certainty of something heavy finding the bottom. She did not speak for a long moment. Then she asked Walter to tell Ruth Ann one thing. Do not give him the quarry. Ruth Ann did not. But small towns are made of patterns, and Daniel had spent his career reading patterns the way Eleanor read grain. He returned to Mabel's kitchen twice more. He visited the hardware store and asked about an older woman buying hinges and roof sealant. He stopped at the flea market where a vendor remembered E. Whitmore selling a restored side table from the back of an old Buick. No one pointed him toward the Quarry Road. But Daniel did not need a pointed finger. He only needed the shape of what people avoided saying, and he had always been fluent in the architecture of silence. Meanwhile, Eleanor made a phone call she had been postponing since the night she left the motel. She dialed Aaron's number on a Tuesday evening, when the quarry was quiet, and the light through the cabin window had turned the color of honey left too long in the jar. She sat at the walnut table with her hands flat on the surface the way she always placed her hands when she needed to feel something solid beneath a conversation that might not hold. Aaron answered on the second ring. His voice carried the sound of dinner being cleared in another room. A glass set down a child's voice asking something she could not hear, the ordinary music of a life happening at full speed. She had called him every Sunday for a year and told him she was fine. She had said it so many times the words had worn smooth like a stone in a river that no longer resembles the rock it started as. This time she did not say it. She told him about the motel, about the boxes in the Buick, about the weeks of libraries and parking lots and bread marked down near closing. She told him about the quarry and the cabin and the stove that nearly killed her and the old man who showed her how to keep a fire alive. She told him about the table, about Ruth Ann, about the card in the window with her name on it. She did not tell him everything. No mother hands over every wound at once. But she told him enough. The silence on the other end lasted long enough for Eleanor to hear her son's breathing change. When Aaron finally spoke, his voice had dropped to the register. Men fall into when they are trying very hard not to cry in a room where someone might hear. "Mom, why didn't you call me?" Eleanor looked at the cabin walls, at the boards she had braced, at the window she had sealed, at the stove she had learned to feed, at the walnut table beneath her hands scarred and honest and standing. Her voice came soft, almost a whisper. "Because I needed to know I could stand up before I asked anyone to help me stay standing." Aaron arrived 4 days later in a rented SUV that looked too clean for the Quarry Road. He parked beside the Buick and sat in the driver's seat for a long time before stepping out. And Eleanor watched from the porch, the way she had once watched him walk to school, knowing she could not carry him and could not stop him, and could only wait to see what his face would tell her when he turned around. He turned around. He saw the cabin, the patched roof, the stacked firewood, the garden behind its fence of reclaimed boards, the workbench with a half-finished drawer front clamped to its surface, the repaired porch where his mother stood in a heavy sweater and work gloves with sawdust in the creases of her knuckles. His face changed slowly, not pity. Eleanor had been afraid of pity the way some people are afraid of heights, not because of the fall, but because of the moment before the fall, when the ground looks so far away that standing feels like a lie. But what she saw in her son's face was not pity. It was the particular grief that arrives when love recognizes how late it came. Aaron crossed the quarry ground and wrapped his arms around his mother, and Eleanor let him. For the first time in over a year, she allowed someone to hold her without pretending she did not need to be held. She pressed her face into his shoulder and breathed in the smell of his coat rental car air freshener and airport coffee, and something underneath that was still the boy who used to fall asleep on her lap while she read to him. And the sound she made was not crying exactly. It was the sound a door makes when it finally opens after being sealed shut so long that even the hinges have forgotten which way they swing. 3 days later, Daniel found the quarry. He came in the late morning when the light was flat and the air smelled of cold stone and the last oak leaves rotting at the tree line. His car appeared at the rusted gate and moved slowly down the service road, and Eleanor knew it was him before she could see the driver's face, because she had spent 4 decades learning the rhythm of his arrivals. The particular hesitation of a man who always paused before entering a room to calculate how he would be received. She was sanding a cabinet door across two sawhorses when he stepped out. Aaron stood near the woodpile. Walter sat on the porch with a cup of coffee. Ruth Ann's car was parked beyond the Buick because Walter had called her that morning, and the people who had helped Eleanor build this life were not going to let her face its dismantling alone. Daniel stopped several feet from the porch. For a moment, he looked at the cabin the way a man looks at a math problem that has produced an answer he did not expect. He had followed the trail to Ash Hollow, carrying a feeling he had mistaken for concern, but that Eleanor recognized immediately as something else. He had come expecting ruin. He had expected to find a woman frightened enough to need him, lonely enough to forgive him, broken enough to make his guilt feel useful. Instead, he found firewood stacked evenly beneath a tarp, a garden with wintergreen still holding against the cold, a workbench with tools organized by size, a porch that did not sag, and Eleanor standing in the quarry light with sawdust on her sleeves and a steadiness in her posture that he had never seen in 42 years of marriage because he had never given it room to exist. His voice sounded smaller than he intended, Eleanor. She set the sandpaper down and removed her gloves one finger at a time, the way she did everything now, with patience, without hurry, without the need to make anyone else comfortable before she was ready. Daniel. There was no welcome in her voice, but there was no performance of pain either, and that unsettled him more than anger would have, because anger is a door that can be opened, and Eleanor had not left him a door at all. He looked around the quarry. You did all this? Not all at once. The answer was quiet, but it carried every cold morning and every bent nail, and every night she had lain in the dark wondering whether the woman she used to be was gone forever or only sleeping. It carried the weight of the table and the stove and the porch boards and the spring path and the $80 and the name on the card in the window and the 4 pages of notes and the 2 keys on the table and the years, the decades of work she had done for him that he had called ordinary until he no longer had access to it. Daniel's eyes moved to the walnut table visible through the cabin window. The table at Mabel's, that was yours. Yes, I recognized it. Eleanor met his eyes. You recognized the work. The correction was gentle, but Daniel felt it the way wood feels the chisel precisely in the place where the grain is weakest. Because there was a difference between recognizing what her hands could do and recognizing the woman those hands belonged to, and Daniel had spent 42 years confusing the two. His voice cracked at the center, not dramatically the way a beam cracks when the weight it carries has finally exceeded what it was built to hold. I'm sorry. Eleanor looked at him for a long time. The quarry held its breath. The wind stopped. Even the drip inside the cabin seemed to pause. I believe you are. I made a mistake. Her voice came without cruelty, which made it impossible to deflect. No. A mistake is forgetting a birthday. A mistake is taking a wrong turn on a road you've driven 100 times. What you did had dates, papers, signatures. It had a woman's name I had to learn from a phone call in my own hallway. Daniel lowered his eyes. There was nowhere to put the truth she had just handed him. It simply stood between them, the way the table stood inside the cabin, scarred and visible, and refusing to be hidden. I can help, he said, with money, with the legal work, with whatever you need. Eleanor looked at the porch she had braced with her own hands, the woodpile she had stacked through the first frost, the cabinet door clamped to the sawhorses half-finished, waiting for her to return. Then she looked back at the man she had loved for 42 years and quietly released for the past one. Her words were not cold. They were not triumphant. They were simply true. I know how to repair things now. Daniel nodded once, and somewhere behind his eyes, in the place where men keep the things they understand too late, he saw the sentence for what it was. Not a rejection, a fact. The woman he had left behind no longer existed, not because she had hardened, because she had finally become whole. He stood outside the circle of warmth that had formed around Eleanor in this quarry, this forgotten place, this life she had built without his permission or his help, and no one invited him in. Not because they were cruel, because the circle was full. Months later, Eleanor would learn that the typed note had come from a property attorney Daniel hired to research the quarry's ownership before he understood what he was looking for or who he might hurt by looking. Daniel had not written the words himself, but he had set the search in motion, and the search had produced a warning meant to clear the land of anyone inconvenient. Eleanor placed that knowledge beside everything else Daniel had done, quietly behind documents, behind signatures, behind the comfortable distance of hired hands. It did not surprise her. It only confirmed what the April date in the property file had already taught her, that the most dangerous decisions are the ones made on someone else's behalf without telling them. The county approved Eleanor's caretaker agreement in early spring, after Walter's written history of the quarry. Ruth Ann's testimony about Eleanor's place in the town, Aaron's organized records, and Eleanor's own meticulous documentation of every repair, every receipt, every date had been reviewed and accepted. It was not sudden, it was not dramatic. It was the way Eleanor had rebuilt everything else. Slowly, carefully, one piece at a time until the structure held. She named her business Quarry Light Restorations. People brought her broken chairs, warped shelves, cabinets with doors that would not close, tables their grandmothers had eaten on and their children wanted to throw away. Eleanor took each one. She cleaned it. She repaired it. She rubbed oil into the wood until the grain remembered warmth. And she never once erased the scars. She only made them strong enough to carry the truth of where the wood had been. Daniel sent a letter months later. Eleanor read it beside the stove on an evening when the quarry was quiet and the fire was low, and the light inside the cabin had the amber softness of something that has been earned rather than given. The letter was honest enough to keep, but it was not powerful enough to reopen the door she had closed. She placed it in the drawer beneath the walnut table beside the old map and the oilcloth and the rusted key that had once belonged to Hattie Groves. Then she went back to work, because peace was not something Daniel could return to her after taking so much of it away. Peace was something Eleanor had built herself the way she built everything now, with steady hands, with patient tools, with the understanding that broken things do not need to become new. They only need to become strong enough to stand. On the first morning of the second year, Eleanor stood on the porch before sunrise with a cup of coffee, warming both hands. The quarry was dark. The air smelled of cold limestone and damp leaves, and the faint sweetness of oak smoke drifting from the stovepipe she had learned to keep clear. Somewhere behind the cabin, the spring she had unclogged moved over stones with a sound like quiet conversation. Then the first light entered the quarry. It came slowly, the way important things do. It touched the far limestone wall and turned it gold. It crossed the quarry floor and found the stacked firewood, the garden fence, the workbench, where a rocking chair waited for its second coat of oil. It moved through the cabin window and fell across the walnut table where 3 keys lay together in a row. The first key was small and ordinary and belonged to a house that no longer knew Eleanor's name. She had carried it for months after the locks were changed, because throwing it away felt like agreeing that 42 years could disappear into something that fit between coins at the bottom of a purse. She did not carry it anymore. But she kept it because forgetting is not the same as erasing, and Eleanor had learned the difference. The second key was heavy and dark with rust, and it had waited beneath the floorboards for decades, holding the memory of a woman named Hattie Groves, who had kept this cabin alive through a war and a bankruptcy and the slow forgetting that happens when the world decides a person's work is too quiet to matter. No one had written Hattie's name in a place that lasted, but the key had lasted, and now it sat on a table that Eleanor's hands had restored. And that was a kind of remembering that did not require ink. The third key was new. Eleanor had made it herself, cut at the hardware store in Ash Hollow, from a blank she chose because its weight felt right in her palm. It opened the cabin door, which she had fitted with a proper lock during the first week of winter, and it hung on a nail beside the entrance where she could find it in the dark. 3 keys, 3 women, if she counted Hattie and herself. 3 versions of the same quiet truth that a life does not have to be loud to be real, and a place does not have to be grand to be home, and the hands that repair what others discard are doing holy work, whether anyone sees them or not. The light reached Eleanor's hands. She looked down at them. They were not the hands she had brought to this quarry. Those hands had been smooth and uncertain, and trained to hold other people's needs so long, they had forgotten the shape of their own. These hands had calluses now, a thin scar across the left thumb from a chisel that slipped in October. Oil in the creases that never fully washed out. They were not beautiful in the way magazines photograph hands. They were beautiful in the way tools are beautiful, shaped by purpose, marked by use, honest about where they have been. The coffee warmed her palms. The quarry filled with light. The cabin behind her creaked softly the way it always did in the cold, and Eleanor no longer heard complaint in the sound. She heard conversation. The old wood talking to the morning, the stove remembering heat, the walnut table holding its scars beneath the window like a journal open to every page at once. Eleanor took a breath. The air tasted of stone and smoke, and the particular sweetness of a place that has been brought back from forgetting by someone who understood that the work itself was the answer, not the money, not the recognition, not the approval of a man who had once held her life in his hands and set it down without checking whether it would break. The work. The patient, ordinary, sacred work of putting damaged things back together without pretending the damage never happened. She finished her coffee. She set the cup on the porch rail. She pulled on her work gloves and walked toward the rocking chair on the workbench because there was oil to apply and grain to follow, and a morning that did not ask her to be anything other than exactly what she had become. Behind her, the 3 keys caught the light on the walnut table and held it. So tell me in the comments, do you think Eleanor was right to keep Daniel outside the life she rebuilt? Or do you believe forgiveness should have opened the door again? And while you are thinking about that, think about this. How many people like Eleanor are disappearing right now? Because everyone assumes someone else is paying attention. If this story stayed with you, if you felt even a small part of what Eleanor carried, share it with someone who might need to hear that starting over at any age is not foolish. It is brave. Subscribe not because you were asked, but because stories like this are what happen when we stop looking away. And if you stayed until the end, thank you. You did what too many people in Eleanor's life forgot to do. You stayed.